Hey everyone, Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today we're going to be working on our 1999 Porsche 911. Today we're going to be covering the water pump and thermostat replacement on our 996. A couple of reasons why you may want to look into this before we get started. As you all know, or if you don't know, welcome to the club. The 996 was the first water-cooled iteration of the 911 out of the whole lifespan of the vehicle. So when this car was introduced, I mean, people gave it a lot of flack for being a water-cooled car. It was no longer air-cooled. It was no longer pure, whatever. Along with that, though, came the issue of now you have another item to service on your 911, i.e. the water pump and the thermostat. So over time, people realized that while this was new to the car, water pumps in general were not a new thing to the world, these cars seem to have a little bit of trouble. You had a lot of failures from the impellers. These like a composite plastic. Our replacement includes a metal impeller, which is a nice upgrade from what they came with originally, but it's just something that the cars were struggling with out of the box back in the day. So at this point in time, these units are pretty well revised, but if you have one that has not had a water pump done, would highly advise looking into it before it fails. A couple of reasons why you may want to look into this. If your pump or thermostat are failing, a couple things you'll notice are overheating potentially or overcooling. If your thermostat is stuck open, the car will never reach temp and it'll be consistently cooling the system down, which isn't good. The car needs to be at operating temperature to function properly. If your thermostat is stuck, then you'll notice that the car is going to overheat fairly quickly, again causing you bigger and further issues. Another thing you can do is look for is if your water pump is failing, you'll notice that the coolant isn't circulating in the system. And sometimes an easy way to check that is by opening up the reservoir cap on your tank. And you can see the feed line that would come into the tank. If coolant's flowing through, you probably have a healthy pump. If no coolant is being circulated, then it's safe to assume that your water pump has failed. These replacements, you want to do them about every 60, 70,000 miles. Whether or not they have failed, that's just a good practice as far as maintenance goes. Now, if you want to know more about your 996 or cover other topics, be sure to visit Porsche996.fcpeuro.com. Now, today we're going to be working with a kit that we saw on the site that includes some antifreeze. We have a new thermostat, gasket, new hardware, and a new water pump. Now, in addition to the kit, we're also going to be replacing one of the coolant hoses, which will show you where that goes. Ours is original, and it's got a little bit of a crack in this three-way portion right here. So, without further ado, before we get started, let's take a look at the tools we're going to need for this job. Tools, baby. For this job, we're going to need a couple basic tools, something like a torque wrench with medium value, something you can do anywhere from 7 foot-pounds all the way to 100. For this job, it's going to be about 7 to 10. We have a 1/2-inch drive ratchet, a couple 1/4-inch and 3/8 drive ratchets as well. We have a couple different 15mm wrenches, a couple sockets including sizing from 10 millimeters all the way to 15 millimeters, as well as a 24. This is going to be for our belt tensioner. We have hose clamp pliers. Any pliers will work, but if you have hose clamp ones, it makes life easier. We got a couple flathead screwdrivers, a pick. Sometimes the coolant hoses get stuck on there, and we're going to be replacing them, so if we pierce through them, not a huge deal. If you're not going to be replacing them, try to use something that isn't as sharp like this one. Some nice to haves is electronic ratchet, just to speed up removal and install of the parts, as well as this airlift vacuum bleeder. This is going to allow us to suck out all the vacuum in the cooling system so that we can pressure fill it. That way we don't have to worry about any air bubbles or anything like that in our system. And not pictured, we are also using, on our case, we're using a screw jack and a piece of wood to support the engine. If you're working on the floor or in your garage, you're going to want to use a floor jack with a piece of wood unless your jack has a rubber pad. And don't forget a catch can or a bucket for the coolant, as this is going to be a pretty messy job. Now that we have the tools covered, let's get started on this DIY. Thank you for joining us, my good people. We are underneath the car at this point. You can see our screw jacks supporting our engine. It's just having the tension being taken out of the mount, nothing more, nothing less. If you're working at home, make sure you're using a floor jack and jack stands. You want to be safe about this. To get started, we're going to work on removing a couple 13mm nuts and bolts, starting by these two 13mm bolts that go through these exhaust clamps. So let's free those up. From here, we're going to go ahead and remove the two 13mm bolts that hold the exhaust brace to the engine cradle. I'll use a 13mm wrench for this one. It's a little bit hidden. From here, we're gonna work on removing the two 15mm nuts at the bottom of the brace here. I'm using a 15mm wrench to break them free, and I'll use a ratcheting end to remove them. Next, we're gonna remove this 10mm alignment bolt, just so we take off the stress from it before we do the top two 15s. Beautiful. Next, we're gonna go ahead and remove the two 15mm nuts at the top of our brace that will hopefully allow us to separate the engine from the brace a bit so we can get to our water pump bolts. Again, these are 15mm. Break these free. Now we got our bolts undone and our nuts, we're gonna go ahead and remove this bracket so it doesn't fall on us. Now we're gently gonna try to separate the engine from the front brace here. I'm just gonna use a small pry bar, super gently, not to hurt the casing. You need to go up with your floor jack, go up with the floor jack. I guess that should give us enough room. Now we got our brace situated. The whole goal of removing these nuts was to give us some room to stick a tool up in here. The next move is going to be to disconnect a couple hoses, starting with this outer one that connects to the water pump. I'm using hose clamp pliers. Put that over to the side. I'm going to use a pick to get this hose freed from the water pump. I'm also replacing this hose, so if I damage it, I'm going to not be too upset about it. If you're going to be doing the same, I suggest you use a dull end flathead or something plastic so you don't pierce your hose. I'm about to. Kelly Clarkson, bro. Getting this hose off is going to take a little bit of your inner Hulk, so make sure you bring that to the table before you get started. Next, we're going to remove that hose clamp that holds our hose to our thermostat. I'm going to use a flathead screwdriver for this. This is like a predator's blood. Next, we're going to remove the other hose that's attached to this same coolant hose that we showed you on the bench, the one we're going to be replacing. It's a tight squeeze up here, but there we go, baby.
I got that too.
Beautiful. You want to be careful when you're moving this hose. It's attached to a plastic pipe. You don't want to damage it. I'm so breaking this pipe. Paris Hilton 2002, bro. Wow. Bitch. Always listen to your camera, people. They know what they're talking about. Look at that. She's freaking free, baby. Now we have our coolant hoses disconnected. Our next move is to remove these two 10mm bolts. These hold down the plastic coolant line that is in the way of getting to our thermostat and water pump. And then from there, we just have the ability to manipulate the line so we can move it out of our way to access the rest of the thermostat bolt. There's one more 10mm back here on the front of the engine towards the transmission, if you will. I'm just going to remove it to give us some more play in the hose. Not necessary, though. Oh, yeah. That was the move, baby. Now we got this plastic line out of the way, we can go ahead and start by removing our thermostat. We got a couple 10mm bolts. I'm going to get to the ones where I can with the ratchet and then do the rest by hand. For this top left one, I'm just using a 1/4" ratchet with a small swivel extension on a 10mm socket. Now we can go ahead and pull the thermostat off of the engine block. Just make sure you have a catch can ready for coolant. Now we got that off, you want to make sure you pull off the old gasket as well. From here we can clean our mating surfaces, and then we're going to continue by removing the water pump before we install our new thermostat. Now that our thermostat's off, we can go ahead and start removing the 10mm bolts around our water pump. I'm going to start with the easiest ones at the bottom and work our way around. As we take the hardware out of our old pump, I'm going to use our new water pump as a guide, and I'm going to put the bolts that we're removing in their holes that they belong in. We have new hardware, but the reason I'm doing this is all the bolts are different lengths, so that way when I go to assemble the new pump in the vehicle, I know what length goes in what hole. So again, I'm just using the new pump as a template with the old hardware, then we'll use new hardware for the install. That is not torque to spec. It is only like 7 foot-pounds. We're accessing the top of the water pump bolts via the engine bay, just because we have plenty of room with the engine brace removed. Bam, baby. Crisp. Now we have all our hardware removed, we can go ahead and remove the water pump from the block. Just be ready for another coolant bath, or not. Easy, baby. Before we install our new water pump, you have to modify the gasket. It's just how they come from the factory. They have an additional portion of them that would be needed if you were going to be removing the whole front coolant passage of the front of the block. We're not doing that. So as you can see, our old gasket looks like this. This one was already cut in the three little notches that we're going to modify our new one on. So just using some cutters, we're going to cut here, here, and here. There we go. Ready for install. With the water pump kit, you're going to see that you have 7 total bolts for it. 2 of them are going to be longer than the rest. If you get them mixed up, we used our new pump as a reference, but if you don't do that and you get it mixed up, don't worry. The longer bolts go on the 2 holes that have dowels, the locating dowels on the pump. So if you are unsure, again, it's just look for the 2 locating dowels on the water pump. Those are going to use the longer piece of hardware. Now that we have everything apart, we're going to clean up the block end and get ready to install our new parts. Before we install anything on the vehicle, we're going to clean up our mating surfaces, mainly the thermostat one. You can see a little bit of residual marks from the old gasket. You can use a Scotch-Brite pad or something that's slightly abrasive but not enough to etch the surface. I have a little bit of a purple Scotch pad here. I'm just going to use that to clean up the housing a bit. We got a water pump ready to go in, gasket on. Again, the dowels help align the gasket as well. Let's get her in, baby. Now we're going to torque all the 10mm on the water pump to 7 foot-pounds or 10 Newton meters. Torqued. Torqued. Wow, we torqued them all down, baby. Now we have our water pump on, we can go ahead and install our thermostat. We've already cleaned the mating surface. I have 2 bolts guiding the gasket, so that way they don't misalign when they go in. Now we have our thermostat on, we're gonna go ahead and torque all 4 bolts down to 7 foot-pounds or 10 Newton meters. Beautiful, we're all torqued. Now we have our water pump and thermostat back in their home. We can go ahead and route this hard cooling line back into its place. Thank you. If you're going to torque these down, you want to torque them down to 7 foot-pounds or 10 Newton meters. Again, this is a 10 millimeter bolt. Now we have our water pump and thermostat in. The next thing to do is put our engine brace back in place. I'm just going to push it right back against the block. Obviously, it's still supported by our jack. Then I'm going to start with our alignment bolt, which is a 10 millimeter. I'm just going to thread it in by hand for now. When we're ready to torque it, it's going to be torqued down to 7 foot-pounds or 10 Newton meters. Next, we're going to put our 15 millimeter nuts back on. Again, these are 15 millimeter, and they're going to be torqued down to 22 foot-pounds. This top brace nut is easier to get from the engine bay. In case you're working on the ground, just hop up and get it started by hand from up above. Now we have our two 15 millimeter bolts secured up top. I've removed my alignment bolt. We can install our bracket back on. This also helps hold on the exhaust bracket, so don't forget it. Now we can put our 10 millimeter alignment bolt back in. If you didn't catch it the first time, it is a 10 millimeter bolt. It's going to be torqued down to 7 foot-pounds or 10 Newton meters. And from there, we can also put in our 15 millimeter nuts. Can he do 2 at once? Amazing. How does he do it? Now we have our bracket secured. We can go ahead and put on our little exhaust bracket here. This was held on by 2 15 millimeter nuts. Before we continue, we're going to go ahead and replace the one coolant hose that we showed you on the bench. Ours is cracked, so to do that, we're going to remove the secondary air pump hose out of the way so we have some better access. From there, we're going to undo this first hose clamp. Just slide that up and pull off the hose from here, just like that. And then we're going to undo the hose clamp at the reservoir, and then we can pull this hose out and put in our new one. Beautiful. Set that to the side, we'll reuse that. I'm just going to feed this hose down the bottom here. And get our new one in place. We're just going to go ahead and slide both of the hose clamps back on. That way we can hook up this coolant hose and continue wrapping up this water pump and thermostat job. Going to put our secondary air pump hose back on. Beautiful. Now we have our new hose in. We can go ahead and reconnect our coolant hoses at our thermostat and coolant pipes. So We're going to start with the thermostat hose. Feed it onto the thermostat housing and then tighten down the clamp. Now we're going to do this upper coolant hose. It goes into our coolant pipe. Now that our hoses are on, we can go ahead and fill the system with coolant using our Airlift 2 vacuum bleeder. So let's go ahead and take care of that. All right, my good people. At this point, you can see we're at the back of the car. We're ready to bleed the vacuum system after our job that we've done today. So what I've done so far is just set up the equipment, the Airlift 2 tool as we're gonna need it. For this specific car, I had to go ahead and remove the 10mm nut that held the tank in place, which you saw earlier. So what I did is I pulled it over so we can get our air line and our suction line in place. And then from here, I went ahead and just gave it a little bit of PSI to make sure that our system didn't have any leaks before we filmed for you guys. So far, the system seems to be holding. You want to pump up your gauge to about 20 to 25. You can see that on the tool instructions. Right now, we're just about 12 pounds of pressure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to crank it up to 20, 25. Couple things to note. If the system is not fully empty, you're going to have some coolant come back up the tool. It's got a breather up here. It's going to spew out a little bit, so you always want to do this with the car as empty as possible. We've tried to do our best on that, but we're for sure going to have some residual. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pressurize the gauge to the level that it needs to be at, and as long as it doesn't drop after about a minute or so of sitting there, then that means our system is completely airtight, and we can work on filling the car up. So let's go ahead and get started on that. You can see we're hitting about 20 pounds almost. We want to get to 24, 26 is a correction. However, as you have noticed by the Niagara Falls scene we got going on here, there is still some coolant in the system that we're battling. So again, this machine does not work really well if you still have a ton of coolant in the vehicle. So we're going to try to get to our desired pressure. If we just flat out can't reach it, we'll try to disconnect a couple more hoses and push out the rest of the coolant in the car and set up again. Now that we've reached our full pressure, the system's holding, we're going to go ahead and dip our suction hose into our mix. We have a 50-50 mix of distilled water and genuine Porsche coolant. You can see it's totally the right color versus what came out of the car. So you want to make sure that your suction end is all the way at the bottom of the bucket at all times so you avoid filling in with any air by accident. So I'm going to get this started and then we'll start filling the system. Now to fill the system, we're simply going to release this blue valve, and then it should instantly pull up the coolant from the bucket. And there you have it, my good people. Pretty straightforward with this vacuum bleeder from Airlift 2, that is. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and remove this tool, put on our cap, and conclude this DIY for you good people. Now, if your reservoir is overfilled, then you can go ahead and use something like a syringe or a baster just to remove any excess. I'm going to make sure that we're at the fill line, and if I need to, I'll top it off with my jug. But otherwise, that should wrap up this filling procedure. And there you have it, my good people. That's going to conclude this DIY for today. Overall, the thermostat and water pump are pretty straightforward to replace. Not too bad of a job. Again, you want to make sure that if you're working on the ground, you're using a floor jack, a piece of wood if you have one to support the sump pump, and of course, be safe more than anything else. A couple notes to recap. Stock units had plastic impellers, so if yours is stock and it hasn't gone out yet, best replace it before it fails. And while you're doing that job, a thermostat is also a good thing to change. Again, thank you for watching, guys. If you like what you saw today, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave those in the comment box below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.